Welcome back to the second part of Chapter 20, A Global Power, 1914 to 1919. I'm Christina Paris, your instructor for History 101, United States History, 1877 to the present. We're going to pick up where we left off in the last lecture by talking about World War I. So we're going to talk about citizens into soldiers. So the war was quite a different experience for compared to previous wars. There was a lot of modern technology that was utilized in World War I. We have the mechanization of warfare, notably new kinds of weapons that were being used. We talked briefly about chemical warfare, which is something that we're not going to see again in wars after World War I. There's actually the bans that are implemented because of the devastating effects that's seen with mustard gas. Some of you may have heard of mustard gas but not be familiar with it. It was a devastating weapon that was utilized, and it left many of what the veterans of World War I, some of them scarred with being blinded or disfigured or with permanent lung issues for the remainder of their lives. And sometimes it even shortened their lifespans because of the consequences of exposure to mustard gas. It's a very harmful chemical. So anyway, obviously we realize that that kind of weapon was very devastating. Also, we see the advent of the first tanks, obviously not particularly sophisticated tanks that were utilized during World War I. Very limited scope of using tanks. They were very mechanized beasts, not very effective, not very useful. They were used on a limited scope. Trench warfare was probably the most grisly and gruesome thing that was utilized during World War I. Also led to a lot of the stalemates that happened during World War I, because it led to the term the men became dug in. It allowed for, obviously, for a way for protection being utilized, but these trenches also became sort of a death trap for some men, because once you got dug in these trenches, it could also be a potential safety trap as well. There were hazards of being entrenched. You had the collection of water that led to a very hazardous complication for the men who went slogging through it, something called trench foot. If you don't know what trench foot is, I recommend you look it up, because to describe it is rather gruesome, and if you're eating right now, I'd recommend not looking it up, because it is a rather gruesome condition that left some young men requiring to have their feet amputated. If trench foot got very advanced. It was a rather grisly condition that developed with their feet. Yeah, it's pretty awful. You have to imagine water being your feet, even with shoes on, soaking in water for days and weeks on end. What happens to shoes, what happens to flesh, and what eventually happens to that flesh. Yeah, and this water was often very cold, sometimes down to the point where hypothermia set in, and yeah, we don't want to go there, and especially not if you happen to be eating right now as you're watching this video. Pretty awful. trenches also were a hazard for the types of weapons that were being used, from the already mentioned mustard gas, and also for larger ballistic artillery rounds that were being utilized. Um, they set into motion the potential for being targeted. Um, Also, we have the advent of different types of arms that are being used um, that serve as a brutal, also ways of just brutalizing the mechanization of warfare as well. And we haven't even talked about our own particularly less than effective technological advent that comes to fruition just ahead of World War One, and that's the airplane. Um, there's oftentimes told the story that the primary cause of death from the Air Force standpoint, or during World War One, was not necessarily planes being shot down as much as these things crashing. Um, the technology was so new that it wasn't that these planes were being shot down by the enemies as much as these things weren't staying in the air long enough to be shot down. They were crashing due to mechanical failures. We still considered airplanes a relatively new technology, and there was still a learning curve to understanding what could go wrong with airplanes and what kept them in the air. And yeah, we didn't quite understand the whole, having to where you mounted guns on planes and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, there was a big learning curve kind of thing going on. So yeah, planes didn't necessarily get shot down as much as they crashed and killed their pilots. So if you can imagine that most of the time it wasn't necessarily them being shot down by enemy fire, it was just them crashing and killing their pilots. That's kind of an interesting thing to think about, that most of the fatalities from air-related fatalities in World War One were not from enemy fire. It was mainly from planes crashing. So it's just something to consider. Then we talk about the 14 points, which we've already alluded to with Wilson. Wilson had come up with these 14 points that he believed needed to be adopted um, by the countries to act as a framework for peace. Now, it's interesting to realize that a number of the countries saw these 14 points as kind of a framework. Really did see Wilson as kind of this hero figure, and he was actually seen as kind of a heroic figure for coming up with these 14 points, and he would long be seen as kind of this heroic, heralder of democracy for a long period after World War One, because his 14 points were not really allotted here in the United States. It was kind of looked at derisively, looked down upon here in the United States. In fact, when he goes for the signing of the peace treaty at Versailles, he's greeted warmly. He's greeted with a great deal of fanfare, and he expects that when he comes back from the treaty signing, that our Congress is going to readily accept the terms of the treaty and accept everything, readily agree to the treaty and ratify it and everything. and Congress actually turns him down flat. And refuses to join the League of Nations, which is actually based off the 14 points. It's actually part of the 14 points, which is something you begin to wonder about why our country was so adamantly against it. But you have to remember, as I mentioned before, there was still a very strong isolationist opinion. And the fact that we entered a war that was not particularly popular, the fact that there's still this strong feeling that we should not have gotten into the war, that it was a European conflict that we kind of begrudgingly got dragged into, that sentiment is still very strong in the United States. And it's going to be strong. It's going to remain very strong, even going forward and going into World War II. We're not going to talk about actually just yet what it is that finally kind of nudges us into the fact that we can't remain isolated. But I think you guys kind of have an idea of what it is that ultimately nudges us that we can't remain this isolated little island of democracy any longer. I think we kind of have a clear idea of what it is that kind of pushes us into the face of reality, that we can't remain this little isolated utopia of democracy in the grander scheme of things. But right now, in this particular time, there's a lot of American sentiment that we need to remain isolated. So with that, we're going to move on and talk about the final offensive. So really, we have the Battle of the Argonne Forest. There's a high number of casualties, but it's reaching a point where there's this stall out, this kind of point where it looks like nothing is moving within the war, where the casualties keep mounting up, but there's really no progress being made on either side towards a real, clear, decisive side winning the war. It's really kind of at this point of who's going to come out of this. The casualties are mounting. Finally, there's this offensive launched, and it comes down to the point of, the Allies getting a assistance from the Americans, where they finally get a ceasefire, and finally we get the armistice signed the 11th hour on November 11. It seems like everything has finally reached its end, but this is where we get that moment where we have essentially left a wounded animal. Because when it comes down to the Treaty of Versailles, there is essentially this sense that we want to end the war with Wilson's view of making sure that there is kind of a sense that nobody is being punitively treated, that there's an open treaty process, which is what the 14 points emphasizes, this open negotiation with the treaty process. And what happens with the Treaty of Versailles is not what Wilson wants to see. It turns very punitively towards Germany. It's very aggressive towards Germany. It turns Germany into ultimately the punching bag. The terms are very anti-German. very much making Germany the punished entity in the treaty signing. Um, and ultimately, it's going to be to Europe's disadvantage, to the world's disadvantage, of leaving these huge reparations payments um, that Germany must pay, because leaving that huge reparations payment is ultimately what leaves Germany bankrupt. Coming out of the First World War, which leads to the rise of the Third Reich, and ultimately a unfortunate person coming into power, who is Adolf Hitler. And I think we all now know what happens when Adolf Hitler comes to power. It sets the stage for the Second World War. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we have Wilson in Paris. Of course, ultimately, his vision of the Treaty of Versailles is not visualized. The Senate rejects joining the League of Nations when he comes back to the United States. And amidst all this turmoil and upheaval of not getting his vision realized, with the United States refusing to join the League of Nations, we also have this backdrop of a Red Scare starting in the United States. Now, it's not going to be a scare of communism quite to the level of what we're going to see in the 1950s. That's a full-scale McCarthyism, communism, fear fest, like the likes of which hopefully we'll never see again. But it's more geared at the anarchists, and to some lesser degree communism, but it's not at the scale that we're going to see in the 1950s. Yes, there's kind of this, well, you know, we gotta be kind of cautious with this communism thing, but it's more focusing on the anarchists and this fascist idea that's starting to take hold in our country. We've seen the drumbeat starting very slowly with towards anarchists and anarchist organizations rising up in the country around this time. But it's really starting to beat the drum a little more firmly, especially towards when it's targeting our labor unions, and that ultimately there's fears with the IWW, which are known as the Wobblies, and their more militant activities. So there's that kind of current that's starting to build up at this point in time in history. But ultimately, what all these tensions get brought to a head, we also have, at the height of all this, unbeknownst to us, is our president falls gravely ill. Wilson has a stroke, a very devastating stroke, which many people do not know for quite a period of time. It's actually an incapacitating stroke towards the end of his presidency. In fact, we don't know for a very long time how incapacitating the stroke was, but because his doctor and his wife actually kept the vice president and public in out of the loop as to how devastating the stroke was. And it is believed that there is a good possibility that Mrs. Wilson may have been making some decisions before the public became aware of just how devastating the stroke was, because the stroke was very incapacitating for Wilson. But that's just recently become clear that his stroke was a very devastating stroke. So, one more thing in this chapter we haven't talked about, which is also something that recently came to the forefront too, was this period of time also encompassed something that a number of us just recently dealt with and kind of revived, pardon me here, was our great pandemic of 1918 and 1919 with the Spanish flu. Now, some of you probably heard discussion of this when we went through our COVID pandemic and the comparisons that were drawn between the two. Now, it was actually 2 waves of the Spanish flu pandemic. The first outbreak took place in the fall of 1918 as the soldiers were returning from the front. It actually came back with the soldiers from the European front. It was highly virulent. What that essentially means is it had a high transmission rate, much like our COVID did. To give you an idea, the famous story is told that people would get on the streetcar. Famous case was of a young man in his early 30s, got on the streetcar with a slight cough, fever. By the end of the route, a couple hours later, he was dead. It was very, very, very serious flu. It killed. It killed many people. We look at how many people we lost with coronavirus. The Spanish flu was very deadly, much more deadly than our COVID. Now, we can attribute that to the fact that we didn't have modern immunizations. We didn't have modern sanitation like we do now. Diets were not as healthy. People were not as healthy, per se, as they are now. We can attribute it to many things. Healthcare was not as state-of-the-art as it is now. We have a lot more supportive care now than they did back then, i.e., the hospitals are much more advanced than they were back then. So, someone would get critically ill now, we can put them on ventilators and things like that. So, somebody who gets very critically ill with COVID, who might have died back in 1918, we can actually give them life support measures to help them recover, whereas back in 1918, they might have just died. So the possibilities of, things like that might have improved the numbers of Spanish flu. But the second outbreak in 1919 was much more of what's called a seasonal infective. In other words, it hit in the fall and winter of 1919. It struck much more like a traditional flu virus. It was just as deadly. It struck down very young and older individuals. Again, followed the same kind of super contagious pattern. I had seen this documentary back when I took a microbiology class, and they talked to people that had actually lived through the pandemic. And it was very fascinating because this one older gentleman, now in his nearly 70s at the time, was reflecting on playing on what he thought were long wooden boxes outside a mortuary. And he said he did not know at the time those long wooden boxes were makeshift caskets. And he said the piles grew higher every day. And he said, lo and behold, him and his buddy, his 6-year-old buddy, caught the Spanish flu. And he said, although he recovered, his friend didn't. His friend died from the Spanish flu. So it gives you an idea of how devastating the flu was. That the body counts rose very quickly. And much like with what happened with the coronavirus for us, the mortuaries couldn't keep up with the number of dead. And back then they didn't have the refrigeration systems to, put bodies on ice. It was the stacks of bodies just grew outside the mortuaries. So, yeah, you could see, hey, the stack of makeshift caskets was, 3 deep and 4 long yesterday, and it's now 6 long and 4 deep today. Ooh. Number of dead's risen quite a bit. Quite a bit, folks, in one day. So, yeah, it gives you an idea. Now, we know that the virus that caused that influenza pandemic is the Spanish flu. Obviously, they didn't know the sophistication of the virus. They did not know a great deal about the virus. They knew basic details. They didn't have the sophisticated knowledge of viruses that we know now. Of course, no vaccine exists for it today. However, we have sampled the virus both at the CDC labs in Atlanta, Georgia, and in Washington, D.C. They're both stabilized, frozen samples. Hopefully, they will not come back into our mainstream, but if they do, hopefully, we will be able to generate a vaccine against them. But from what several virologists have said of studying the Spanish flu, the virus mutated at an incredible rate. And that was kind of the scary thing when the coronavirus first emerged, that it shared a lot of traits initially with the Spanish flu of its mutation rate. Fortunately, the mutations were not significant, but the Spanish flu, with some of the notes that the original doctors noticed with the Spanish flu, its mutation rate was extremely fast, which is a little alarming because generally viruses that mutate fast, that can make creating vaccines challenging. You don't want a virus that mutates incredibly fast. You need to create vaccine that will be able to hit the virus. So it's kind of alarming to thinking of something like the Spanish flu getting started again that might be a little bit difficult to try to control, to create a vaccine against. So hopefully it never comes back, but we'll see. So anyway, with that, we've reached the end of chapter 20, and with that cheerful note about the prospect of the Spanish flu, if we don't need it, something else to worry about after dealing with coronavirus. We'll go ahead and move on to chapter 21. And hopefully, I haven't scared you to death now with talk of the Spanish flu. I encourage you to research the Spanish flu outbreak in 1919 and 1918. It is a very fascinating topic, and it's interesting how many things mirrored our coronavirus epidemic. It was very fascinating to go back and look over some of the aspects of the coronavirus pandemic and compare it to the 1918 pandemic, because it was there were a lot of similarities between the two. So anyway, with that, we'll move on to chapter 21.